Today I'll be talking with Dr. Alexandra Filindra, who is a University of Illinois Chicago political scientist. We'll discover that Obama deported more people in his 2 terms than the previous presidents of more than 100 years. We'll also learn that DACA does not give anybody protection from deportation. It only defers for what will inevitably happen. Today on Roundtable Perspective. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Alexandra Filindra, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Chicago.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you're here. This is good timing. You specialize in immigration policy, public policy, and as a political scientist, you look at public opinion. And today we'd like to talk a bit about immigration, perhaps the DACA, the Dreamers, get some of the code words out so that the audience can understand. So I don't want to spend the whole day talking about DACA, but maybe you could just summarize what the Deferred
Action
Act is.
program is. Well, what has happened is that in the U.S. today, we have about 11 million people who, in one way or another, have ended up here without having proper immigration status. And some of them have brought with them very young children. When they came in, these children were as young as days old to maybe teenagers. And thousands of these children, hundreds of thousands in fact, have grown up in the United States. And even though they went to school here and even to college in many cases, they're unable to work. And President Obama in 2012 made an executive decision, passed an executive order to allow these children, these youth, to be protected from deportation on one hand, and also receive the ability to work, a work permit on a temporary basis, as a temporary solution to the impasse of immigration reform that Republicans and Democrats were not willing and unable to pursue.
I think that's an important point, and a lot of times when you hear the conversations in the media or in the hallways, people don't recognize that. It's a deferred action
on deportation.
Yes, so it doesn't mean you don't get deported. It means it's deferred for 2 years, and either it has to be renewed or you would still be deported. So it's not actually changing the laws or doing anything. It just gives, like you said, children a window of 2 years before they can apply for legal immigration, or they will be deported.
Correct. I mean, basically, it just gives them a reprieve and the ability to stay in the country temporarily for as long as the status exists, and with the hope that something will change so that they are able to change their status, because as it stands, there is no channel for any of these 11 million, including the Dreamers, to pursue legal permanent residency.
This would have been true even if the law wasn't, or if the act wasn't rescinded. I mean, if you're DACA,
correct.
It's whether that act is rescinded or not, it doesn't change your status as being an illegal immigrant, and you're kind of stuck. You just have a 2-year abeyance, but not much more than that.
Yes, they continue to be, in a sense, undocumented.
Yes.
They continue to be outside of the legal immigration process without recourse. They don't have an option under which they can go and change their status.
I just find it ironic that there's so much energy stuck around protecting DACA when it really isn't protecting anybody. It's just deferring the inevitable. But I guess my bigger question is, why now? Why does immigration become such a volatile topic now?
It has been a big issue for a while. This is not the start of the movement to push against immigration. In the most recent terms, it started with the Tea Party.
Again, I find that ironic and slightly disconcerting because, as you said, immigration isn't something that just came with the last presidential election or with the rescinding of this particular act. In fact, when you put it in even a short-term historical perspective, when Clinton was president, the 1996 law completely changed protections and it increased enforcement. And so I understand what the perception is, but the perception and the reality on the ground for people that are actually undocumented and get deported is not radically different now, even than when Obama was president.
Correct. Actually, immigrant advocates were calling Obama the deporter-in-chief because under his watch, the number of deportations, especially in the early years, increased exponentially. It was over 1 million.
I read that during the Obama presidency, more than 2.5 million undocumented workers were deported.
Correct.
Which is more than 100 years of deportations.
Correct.
But somehow the public perception is that the current administration is anti-immigrant, but the one that was prior that actually on the ground was deporting people at a much higher rate than ever before is somehow seen as a protector of immigrants or a
True. And also, one part of it is that under Obama, ICE was directed to focus on criminals and on people who had multiple offenses and people that were considered dangerous for American society.
That sounds like a lot of Trump's rhetoric.
Well, we generalized it.
Yes.
We definitely, it seems that we went from targeting specific categories with criminal records and things like that to actually having more of a open season on all undocumented. And I mean, the stories that are coming out today in the press in terms of
well, again,
the people targeted.
I would want to challenge that because I know during the Obama presidency, after the U.S. supported the coup in Honduras, they began sending back, in 2014, they sent back 87,000 children to Central America, and the LA Times reports that many of those kids were sent back and they were shot when they got off the train. So when we say it was specifically focused on criminals, again, the track record of the previous 3 administrations is not radically different.
It's absolutely, I mean, I don't disagree with you, and actually it was a huge challenge, I think, for the Obama administration that because of what was happening in Central America, you had the crisis of the unaccompanied children arriving at the border.
There didn't seem to be any compunction, though, about sending them back, even though you knew they would be killed
correct.
as soon as they got back. So.
But they were more amenable to, in some ways, to pressure from advocacy groups, I think.
Well,
not to defend the Obama administration.
Well, no, I'm just
here,
I'm questioning because I don't want to talk about a president
Yes.
or an administration. I just want to talk that 87,000 kids were sent back to Central America, even though the LA Times reporting on the front page, when they get sent back, they are killed.
American public opinion is at best ambivalent about immigration. But generally is either in favor of a status quo, don't bring any more than we already have, or reduce immigration numbers. We have had a question included in many, many surveys going back almost 100 years now. And what we see is that when you ask Americans, should the numbers of immigrants coming to the US increase, decrease, or stay the same, the majority are in the stay the same or decrease category. What changes over time is also the economy, is how businesses relate to the immigration question, the needs of the market. And what we have seen in recent years is actually that demand for more open immigration among businesses has declined somewhat. If you look at who participates at congressional hearings.
That probably depends on the business or the industry.
Correct.
Yeah.
You still have the technology sector that has certain needs.
Hotel and restaurant and.
To a certain extent, but there is less business pressure and more accommodation. And one of the positions that political scientists, or one of the arguments that political scientists have promoted, is that essentially if you take out the business concerns that counter what the two sides, especially of the Republican coalition, which is the pro-business and the pro-nativist side, the more cultural protectionist side, you're left with more of the protectionist side. So you see a different approach promoted within the Republican Party. The Democratic Party has always traditionally had two sides to the immigration issue. This is one of the few issues where the two parties are not polarized in the exact same way than you see in areas like abortion or other social issues, because even within the Democratic coalition, you have a protectionist contingent. You have work unions who traditionally were very suspicious of immigrants because of the way immigrants were used in union politics to break up unions and to create issues. So it's been only since the 1990s that the position of unions has changed on the issue of immigration, and unions realize that recruiting immigrants into unions is a better strategy than resisting immigration.
As a political scientist, where you're saying we have these two parties that seem diametrically opposed on so many social issues, but part of it is the divisions within those two parties themselves don't break down along whatever traditional you might have. So talk to me about that a little bit more. There seem to be similar attitudes on immigration?
There are, for different reasons, there are contingents within each party that takes a pro-immigrant or an anti-immigrant approach for very different reasons.
So the pro-immigrant on the Republican side, would that be the businesses?
Okay,
like,
correct.
Okay.
So who want more of a guest worker program. What they're interested in is having access to a labor force that they need, whether it is temporary labor force of the kind that agriculture needs, or more permanent high-skilled labor force that Microsoft needs.
I read recently the Restaurant Owners Association said that they expect 1.8 million new jobs in the next 10 years, and that will not be met by the birth rate in the United States. So their interest is to allow us to have, so that would be one part that says, let's not go crazy on stopping the immigration because we need this for our, in this case, a business to function.
Correct. And traditionally, the way that the US law has functioned has been to focus on penalizing immigrants rather than employers. There has been a wink and a nod in the law in terms of the employers for a very long time. It was about knowingly hiring undocumented. And of course, if somebody fills out a form and puts down a social security number, how do you know unless you check? So states have taken it upon themselves to implement the E-Verify system, which requires employers to actually check and thus know.
And they don't want that responsibility. They want to be able to hire at will. So that's one section of the business section, and the pro-immigration or tolerant of immigration in the Democratic Party.
Well, you have immigrants themselves that are a big constituency within the Democratic Party. You have people on the left in general who believe that for reasons of human rights and for reasons of liberty and for a variety of other moral considerations. Immigration is important, family reunification is important, so including immigrants is important.
Kind of the Good Samaritan.
That, and yes, and also like basically having the immigrant tradition upheld.
Yes.
And
then within the Democratic Party, there's the anti-immigration contingent, which is driven by
concerns about the labor market, about competition with the lower strata, because what the studies show is that when there are competition wage effects of immigration, they're generally considered to be small. They're about 2 or 3% of wages are depressed, basically. But it is concentrated at that very low of the wage.
Because people that come here are willing to work for less just for a job, whereas others may not be. So it brings the whole wage scale down.
Correct, and it's actually
pressure.
what we know is that the competition is in within jobs that are immigrant, basically that are filled by immigrants.
Right.
So it's an intra-immigrant competition rather than between Americans and immigrants. But it does, new immigration does
Still,
bring down wages in certain very low wage sectors, like the restaurant business, like agriculture,
and
like
then
things like
the
that.
remaining, well, I know there's probably multiple contingents, but the other large contingent in the Republican Party that's against immigration or wants to restrict it even more is driven by
cultural concerns.
Okay.
Basically, they're concerned about changes to American identity. They worry about linguistic enclaves where you have people who seem to speak exclusively Spanish, and that is disconcerting. It is, people think they do feel threatened about whether these new immigrants are actually adapting to American culture and accepting American values, or they're a nation apart and they're breaking apart the country culturally. And for a good portion of the Republican electorate, those concerns that have to do with difference, they're not like us, they're different.
So all of those things are part of public opinion that are going to affect public policy. The interesting thing is that each of those factions or contingents conduct their own public relations campaign, their own media framing campaign, their own persuasive campaign. And then it comes back to the question of why certain of those get a more public hearing in certain communities, and it probably has to do with the fact that wages have pretty much been static for 40 years. Employment seems to go up, but the quality of life doesn't seem to follow. The threat of immigration seems to be, you can tap into that relatively easy without even having like the facts that the industry says don't get there.
The fact that wages have been stagnant for a long time, if that were a big factor here, we should have seen this happening progressively over time as wages became stagnant. Our data suggests that this is more about how people feel as members of community and about their identities than about pure financial reasons.
No, I'm agreeing with you. I was an auto worker for a long time. I was a steel worker, and I remember it was in the 80s. There would even be demonstrations that some of the unions would organize, and they would get hammers out and beat up Japanese cars because Japanese imports were hurting us. Whereas now that's not so much the case, because major auto producers in Alabama and even Indiana are Toyota, Honda, and BMW. So, whereas it's easy to point to Mexican immigrants as the threat. So it's not that the concern isn't there; it's that the target of the concern seems to be manipulated.
It is certainly. It is certainly it's a cultural threat, and
a perceived threat.
Correct. Everything is perceived, right? I mean, it's what we have in our heads. It's the pictures in our heads, Walter Lippmann would say.
Right, but there really could be a threat. I mean, there are threats, and then there's also perceived threats. Sometimes they're the same thing, and sometimes they're not. So
they're exaggerated perceived threats that basically they're exaggerated because our trusted elites tell us of how much more of a threat
the interesting
they are.
thing, and we maybe we can end on this, and you could talk about this a little bit, is that attempt or that appeal doesn't always find a hearing. And my question is, we see cities that offer sanctuary or police departments that are not going to cooperate with ICE and the immigration. So even though there may be an attempt to persuade, it hasn't been successful. And what do you make of cities that are saying sanctuary or cities that are saying the police are not going to go out of their way to cooperate?
Cities are caught in between a rock and a hard place when it comes to immigration for a couple of reasons. First of all, they are the primary hosts of the majority of immigrants in the United States. It still is the case that most immigrants flock to the cities because that's where the jobs are, and also
So
that's where the other
cities with large
immigrants.
immigrant populations will be more likely to resist.
They're more likely to resist for several reasons. Cooperation with ICE and enforcing immigration law when you're a strapped city police department is costly. It's an additional process that you don't get paid for. In addition to that, it creates hostility and suspicion with an immigrant community. Immigrants tend to live in low-income communities that are already have their own social problems, high crime. The last thing that you want if you're the police department is to actually end cooperation with the local communities and not have the ability to get information from local residents who are victims of crime or who know about things that are about to happen. So there are very good practical reasons why cities are very, very concerned about the crackdown of immigration because it actually makes their job of policing and
More
improving the
difficult.
quality of life very, very difficult. And that's why sanctuary movements have been endorsed by many cities. They started in the 80s with refugees from Salvador. Yes, exactly. And it was actually a Catholic movement. It was straight out of the Catholic Church to protect refugees. And it has expanded into a national city movement because it doesn't make just sense partisanly and politically. It makes sense from the perspective of the police and from the perspective of city officials. It makes life easier to actually cooperate and work with immigrants because there are blended families. The fact that there's one undocumented in one family, it means that everybody else
even
will
one
maybe,
Mexican and one Polish person,
doesn't,
right? I mean,
yes. I mean, you have all kinds of statuses within families. You have all kinds of situations, and the last thing you want if you're the police department is to not get cooperation and not to be able to prevent crime because of this.
This is one of those things where when we talked about threats and perceived threats, it seems that this is, it kind of becomes facts on the ground. You're saying cities that become large immigrant population are going to have a different political stance. So someone that sees the threat of a culture from the outside coming, they have absolute evidence that this is true. Because the facts on the ground are, when you have larger immigrant communities, including documented or undocumented, it changes their political power and how they might use that. So to say that there's this threat is probably true. You can point to it. If you're saying that there is such a difference between me and you and somebody from this country and that country, it can be seen that way, and there's kind of facts to demonstrate that. I guess the larger question is it really a threat on my quality of life or our quality of life to have more immigrants? That's the...
As an immigrant, I would probably say no, but maybe I'm biased on that. But immigration actually has incredible benefits for the United States. Cultural benefits, economic benefits, social benefits. It made the United States what it is. we have a tradition and a history as a country of immigrants, reluctant, but it's
Yes.
there, ambivalent, but it's there. And we have gained and continue to gain immensely from immigration.
I would say that's a good place for us to end. We could have this conversation. Maybe you'll come back and we'll be able to talk
Anytime.
again. But I mean, your example of the immigrants and the talent that brings and how we benefit from it, I think was shared with us in this conversation. So
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Alexandra Filindra, I thank you for being with me. Joining me on Roundtable Perspective, I'm Lee Artz, and I'll see you next time.